Welcome, I'm Tracy Wallach. This is one in a series of videos that will attempt to introduce systems psychodynamic thinking to important social policy issues in the U.S. In this video, I will provide an overview of critical race theory and offer a systems psychodynamic perspective on how it is being discussed today. In the past few years, critical race theory, or CRT, has become a contentious issue in U.S. politics. The term was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, though some of the basic ideas have been central to BIPOC scholars' work for decades. For white Americans, the theory has been rather obscure, taught in some law schools and other graduate programs. In September 2020, then-President Trump issued an executive order excluding from federal contracts any diversity and inclusion training seen to contain, quote-unquote, divisive concepts, race or sex stereotyping, and race or sex scapegoating. CRT was considered to be divisive content. The order has since been rescinded by President Joe Biden, but the controversy remains. As of June 2022, 7 U.S. state legislatures have passed outright bans on the teaching of CRT. 16 more states have anti-CRT legislation in process. However, anti-CRT measures have been implemented at other levels in every other state except for Delaware. While most efforts focus on K-12 schools, there have been about 100 instances across the country where states, counties, or the federal government have tried to eliminate CRT from college classrooms. On the local level, parents have organized to disrupt school board meetings to protest the teaching of CRT in K-12 schools. These local protests are often resourced and supported by national radical right-wing organizations. Many go beyond simple protests and have turned into campaigns to recall school board members or entire boards. Yet, across the country, conservative and liberal teachers alike state that CRT is not actually taught in K-12 settings. Scholarship on CRT is typically found in legal and academic journals and is not accessible to K-12 teachers or part of the K-12 curriculum. So what is the controversy really about? Much of the recently passed legislation is written in language that is so vague that it is unclear what they cover. This is likely because those who wrote the legislation don't understand what CRT is. It has become a catch-all phrase for all manner of diversity and inclusion initiatives or multicultural training. The impact has been a growing fear that such legislation will have a chilling effect on the teaching of American history in K-12 schools. And it's quite possible that this is the actual intent. Systems psychodynamic theory offers a way for us to think about what is going on in a group, organization, or larger system like society by looking beneath the surface at what is really happening in a system. Here, I will be discussing CRT and the controversy around it from a systems psychodynamic perspective. But first, let's talk about what CRT actually is. CRT is a systems approach that has its underpinnings in the philosophical and legal writings of Derek Bell in the 1970s and early 1980s. Bell was a lawyer, professor, civil rights activist, and academic. He was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. Working first in the U.S. Justice Department, he then moved to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where he supervised over 300 school desegregation cases in Mississippi. While much of his early career was spent as a civil rights lawyer and activist, he later concluded that many landmark civil rights decisions had limited practical impact. He believed that racism is so deeply rooted in American society that it continually reasserts itself after each wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. Bell came to Harvard Law School in 1969, publishing a casebook on race, racism, and American law in 1970, around which he later designed a course of the same name. He left Harvard in 1980 when the school refused to hire more people of color. No one was assigned to teach the course. In 1982, a group of students, including Kimberlé Crenshaw, organized a series of speakers to conduct a version of the class. Beginning in the 1970s, a group of progressive legal scholars, mostly white, was advancing the idea that the law, rather than being a neutral system based on objective principles, actually operated to reinforce the status quo of established social hierarchies. While articulating the ways in which the legal system upheld inequality, critical legal studies, or CLS, did not deal with the particularities of race. In 1989, Kimberlé Crenshaw, Neil Gatanda, and Stephanie Phillips organized a workshop at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called New Developments in Critical Race Theory. They coined the term to locate their work at the intersection of critical legal studies and questions of race, power, and the law. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework used in law schools and graduate education that emphasizes that systemic racism is ingrained in American society and embedded into laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. CRT is a complex and evolving theory, but there are 4 tenets. The first is that race is a social construct. Not until the 1680s was there written evidence in books, pamphlets, diaries, letters, or public records in which racialized phrases were used. For example, white man, white person, or white woman. There are no scientific markers, such as DNA, that determine race. In fact, there is more DNA variation within particular racial or ethnic groups than between them. So race is ideological rather than biological. Second, racism is a normal feature of society and is embedded in systems and institutions that reproduce inequality. It is part of our daily lives and it affects everything. Third, racism is not about bad apples, but is codified in law, embedded in our structures, and woven into public policy. Finally, CRT recognizes the relevance of people's lived experiences to scholarship. Many of our nation's systems and structures, including the legal system, were created when people of color were denied full participation in American society. Perspectives of people of color are often excluded in scholarship. So scholarship is often biased in favor of the dominant Western European and male perspective. Here are some examples of race-based laws and policies. This list that I'm about to go through is by no means exhaustive. The Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 were federal laws that allowed the capture and return of runaway slaves within the United States territory. The 1793 Act authorized local governments to seize and return escaped slaves and imposed penalties on anyone that assisted in their escape. A harsher version of the act was passed in 1850, adding more restrictive provisions and imposing harsher penalties to anyone interfering with the capture of a runaway slave. At the end of the Civil War, the Southern states enacted the Black Codes to replace the previous slave codes. These allowed African Americans certain rights, such as legal marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to courts, but denied them the right to testify against whites, serve on juries or in state militias, or start a job without the approval of the previous owner. The codes ensured the availability of cheap labor. They were repealed when Reconstruction began in 1866. The Reconstruction era lasted from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1877. The focus of Reconstruction was to bring the Southern states back into full political participation in the Union. Additionally, it guaranteed rights to former slaves. It was during this era that African Americans made significant gains in education, politics, and business. In 1867, Southern whites, unhappy with the gains African Americans were making during Reconstruction, turned to violence. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups emerged and began to violently target African Americans, local political leaders, and whites who challenged white authority. Pig laws were enacted after the failure of Reconstruction in 1877. They were designed to replace the social controls of slavery that were removed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. These laws penalized poor African Americans for minor infractions such as taking a farm animal and other quote-unquote vagrancy laws, such as walking along railroad tracks. They thus allowed local authorities to arrest freed people and commit them to involuntary labor, also known as slavery. The 1875 Civil Rights Act had stated that all races were entitled to equal treatment in public accommodations. An 1883 Supreme Court decision clarified that the law did not apply to private persons or corporations. The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision ruled that separate but equal was fair and not a violation of the 14th Amendment requiring equal protection to all. After the Plessy decision, Jim Crow laws throughout the South further ensured and enforced segregation. Schools, theaters, restaurants, and transportation cars were segregated. Poll taxes, literacy requirements, and grandfather clauses not only prevented blacks from voting, but also made them ineligible to serve on jury pools or run for office. In 1934, during the Depression era, the Federal Housing Administration was established to deal with the housing shortage. It was designed to provide housing to white, middle, and lower-class families in suburban expansion. The program was deliberately segregated, subsidizing builders to mass-produce entire subdivisions for whites and requiring that none be sold to African Americans. Further, they refused to insure mortgages near or in African American neighborhoods. This practice came to be known as redlining. Grassroots organizing and activism, including nonviolent protests, boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives, and legal actions by African Americans and allies, brought about landmark legislation and policies aimed at remedying ongoing legal discrimination and disenfranchisement of African Americans. In their 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and ruled that state laws that established racial segregation in public schools were unconstitutional. The policy of affirmative action in its current form was introduced in 1961 through an executive order by President John F. Kennedy to combat discrimination based on race, creed, color, or national origin in the hiring process, the workplace, and higher education. Since 1965, government contractors have been required to file compliance reports documenting their affirmative action programs. The policy was expanded in 1967 to address gender discrimination. Employers were required to make an effort to expand employment opportunities for women and minorities. Affirmative action was implemented in an attempt to remedy discriminatory practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The act also prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and federally funded programs. It strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The law banned literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting and enforced the 15th Amendment on a federal level. It also allowed for federal examiners who could register voters in certain jurisdictions. Facing a flurry of legal challenges, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality in a number of rulings from 1965 to 1969. In 1970, Section 5 was extended for 5 years. In the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision, the Supreme Court ruled that pre-clearance and federal reviews of certain states' voting procedures were outdated. In the next 5 years, at least 23 states had enacted newly restrictive statewide voter laws. These include polling place closures, voter ID laws, and limits on early voting, and more. In 2021 alone, after the 2020 election, which saw the highest voter turnout in a century and the defeat of Donald Trump, 19 state legislatures enacted 33 laws that made it harder for Americans to vote. 25 other states enacted 62 laws which expanded voting access. CRT is a systems theory that examines how racism continues to persist in American society despite all efforts made to eradicate it. The slave codes, pig laws, Jim Crow, Federal Housing Administration policies, and other examples provided here illustrate what CRT maintains. That is, racism and discrimination are embedded in our legal codes, our institutions, and society. Efforts made to remedy systemic racism, from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts to affirmative action, have all provided temporary relief, but also led to backlash and clawbacks of hard-won rights. This is what Derek Bell concluded, that racism is so deeply embedded in American society that it resurfaces after each wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. The election of the first Black U.S. President, Barack Obama, led many to believe that the U.S. was now in a post-racial era. The Black Lives Matter movement raised awareness of racism embedded in our policing and criminal justice systems. Yet these gains have also been accompanied by intense backlash in the form of a new rise of white supremacy groups, a sharp increase of hate crimes, some involving mass shootings, and current attempts to ban the teaching of CRT in schools. Efforts to ban critical race theory in schools ironically exemplify one of CRT's basic tenets, that racism is deeply rooted and embedded throughout our legal and social systems. Psychoanalytic theory may offer some ideas to help us understand more of the why. Why is racism so pervasive and so deeply rooted in this country? Volkan contends that massive trauma involving dramatic losses of life, property, or prestige, and/or humiliation by another group can result in regression in the whole society. Societal regression functions to protect or repair a sense of group identity. It is characterized by, among other things, the loss of individuality, extensive use of projective mechanisms leading to a sharp division of us and them, and a sense of entitlement to do anything in order to maintain its shared group identity. He further asserts that the failure to adequately work through the trauma and mourn these losses can lead to the transmission of the trauma to later generations. Viewing the backlash to CRT through systems psychodynamic theory, I contend that efforts to ban CRT reflect a societal regression and serve as a social defense to repair the dominant culture's, in this case white people's, sense of group identity. The original immigrant settlers of this country were Europeans, comprised of prisoners, impoverished people, Puritans, and others escaping religious persecution. Some came here willingly, and others were forced or tricked into leaving England, Ireland, and Scotland for the New World. Many were brought over as indentured servants. These European immigrants brought with them their trauma from centuries of religious persecution, violence, war, famine, and plague, which they then perpetrated on others in the New World, particularly Native Americans and Black Africans, almost all of whom had been brought here by being kidnapped and forcibly enslaved. Menachem states that the concept of the Negro was created to help white Americans deal with the hatred and brutality that they and their ancestors had themselves experienced for many generations at the hands of more powerful white bodies. He also says that the carnage perpetrated on Blacks and Native Americans in the New World began on the same soil as an adaptation of long-standing white-on-white practices. This brutalization created trauma that has yet to be healed among white bodies today. Critical race theory challenges some important aspects of American identity. As defenders and protectors of democracy around the world, as innocent yet heroic figures that could somehow divorce themselves from the historical past to create a new Eden. This has been referred to as the American Adam in literature. This fantasy manifests in American literature, cinema, and politics. To teach critical race theory, or more fittingly, to teach more than the good white settler narrative of American history, means to actively grapple and come to terms with our undemocratic tendencies, with the less heroic and more imperial aspects of ourselves. It also means to acknowledge and confront the harms that we have done in the world, both in the conquering of North America and overseas, often in the name of democratic values. And so, those attacking CRT do so as a social defense to protect white Americans from the anxiety of losing their identity as completely innocent guardians of democracy. Those that fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. This quote is Winston Churchill's paraphrase of the famous Santayana quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The inability to face trauma experienced at the founding of this nation has resulted in that trauma being transmitted and repeated in future generations. Until we commit to learning from all our history, including that of Indigenous, Black, and people of color, we will continue to reproduce oppressive systems in our country and abroad. Engaging with the reality of our past is essential for learning, adaptation, and change. For more information about critical race theory, American history, and trauma, please see the following references. To learn more about my coaching and consulting practice, please visit my website at www.tracywallach.com.